So, can I start by asking Dr. Tharoor, Shashi, to tell us what he had in mind when he started this book?
Oh, that's right. Am I audible? Is the mic good enough to catch me in the back? But first of all, thank you, Nandita, for that very sweet introduction. Yes, I've known her since I was about 2.5 years old, so we go back an awful long way, and though spanking hasn't been too often on the agenda, sharp words have. And I do want to say that Nandita has been a very excellent foil, because our views differ on many things, but I have a lot of respect for her scholarship and erudition. And when I wrote my book, Why I'm a Hindu, it was to Nandita I turned to read the manuscript. From her perspective, she's also, in fact, I would argue, probably more serious scholar of Hinduism, and her insights and comments, including disagreements, were extremely useful in finalizing that book. On Mr. Sai Deepak, I'm meeting him for the first time, and I'm embarrassed to say that I have not read his book, so he will be speaking about mine, and I will not be able to respond with knowing comments about his. Oh, it was only released last week, so I have a good excuse. Since last week, I have been running around the country on an official tour of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Information Technology, and we've been in Chennai since last night. In fact, this afternoon, we've just come from an excellent visit to the IIT Madras campus, where they are doing astonishing work on 5G technology with a test bed and evolving a wholly indigenous prototype. So I urge you to look forward to seeing more things coming out of your city that will plunge us into the second decade of actually the third decade of the 21st century, right in front of where things ought to be in the communication space. But anyway, that's one of the reasons why my mind hasn't been on the issues of this book, but rather on the future. But listening to Nandita talking about the book gave me, I think, the perfect launch, because when I wrote The Battle of Belonging, I actually intended initially to start off with a sort of personal meditation on nationalism. Many of you may be familiar with the 20th century's two most famous essays on nationalism, Rabindranath Tagore's towards the end of the First World War, and George Orwell's in the middle of the Second. And both of them were writing at a time when the world seemed to be riven apart by nations fighting each other, and they both wrote about nationalism with a certain degree of hostility, if not disdain. For Tagore, nationalism was a very poor substitute for humanity and for global humanism. For Orwell, nationalism was patriotism gone wrong. That is, that patriotism for him was admirable and nationalism was most emphatically not. I thought it was time to rethink some of these ideas from the perspective of the second decade of the 21st century, and to look back on what we have in many ways learned and seen of nationalism globally since these two very great minds addressed themselves to it, as well as how these ideas have been applied in the Indian context. And in my case, as I began contemplating how I would address it, I realized I'm not Tagore or Orwell. I really need to also dig into the scholarship that exists as a vast literature of scholarly writings, particularly, as Nandita said, by political scientists on the subject. And whereas when Tagore was speaking, as he was at that time in a series of lectures, or Orwell was writing, one could sort of get away with it. And if you want, there's one more in whose company those two belong, and that would be the late 19th century speech turned essay by the French scholar, philosopher, political philosopher Ernest Renan, who talked about what is a nation for the first time in modern terms. And I thought, since so much has happened, I need to see what the scholars are saying. And by the time I'd immersed myself in the scholarship, I thought it was necessary to at least give a summary of what all these very serious thinkers are thinking about before getting into what I wanted to say. So the net result is a somewhat longer book than I had intended to write when I started out. But here's what it tries to do. In the beginning, the first 100 pages or so is essentially a summary of the state of global literature on nationalism and on belonging. In other words, I've taken Tagore, I've taken Orwell, I've taken Renan, I've taken also a lot of the scholars. Benedict Anderson famously said that a nation is an imagined community. many other scholars that perhaps non-political science buffs may not have heard of. And they're all there, and through their research, analysis, writing, and historical examples, I've talked about what nationalism and what nationalism is, the various kinds of nationalism that exist in the world, and where we go with that. And I've also drawn my own distinction between nationalism and patriotism. I don't quite follow Tagore and Orwell exactly, because I think Tagore's faith in universal humanism is wonderful as a spiritual concept, not so useful as a political one today. And Orwell's sort of almost visceral hatred of nationalism was very much influenced by what he saw of nationalist movements in Europe in the 20s, 30s, and early 40s, whereas today we see that there can be good things about nationalism as well, in ways that Orwell was not prepared to admit. But I actually valued his distinction between nationalism and patriotism, and I too, building on Orwell, came to the view that there's a very important distinction, which is that patriotism is about love for your country, simply because it belongs to you and you belong to it. The way you love your mother. You may not claim that your mother is the most beautiful woman in the world or the most perfect woman in the world, but she is your mother, you love her. And the same way, a patriot loves their own country because it's theirs, and in a fairly uncritical way, you know. You love the streets, the sounds, the smells, the people, the languages, the music, the cadences, the flag, all of that. Even if to a stranger, there's nothing terribly appealing about all of these things, but to you, because it's yours, you love it. That's to my mind, patriotism. And the nationalist is caught up in an idea of his country that is wrapped up in the state. That is the flag, the army, the sometimes ruling ethos as well. And very often the nationalist defines his allegiance in opposition to others. So that, as I write in a sentence in the book, though they seem fairly similar, a patriot is prepared to die for his country, whereas a nationalist is prepared to kill for his state. And this is, to my mind, a rather important difference. Then I analyze these various kinds of ideas. I talk about the whole typology of nationalisms, but I essentially come down to a clear division between two kinds of nationalism. Nationalism that inheres in immutable factors of identity. That is, nationalism that emerges from your birth, your blood, your religion, your language, the kind of nationalism, if you like, that arose in the 19th and the first half of the 20th century and that Orwell so despised, that kind of nationalism, which is a nationalism linked to identity and to perceptions of identity, versus what I describe as civic nationalism, which is a nationalism that is inherent. Sumati, do come. Member of Parliament from Chennai. She's a member of my committee and that's why she's late. Come. So the civic nationalism is a nationalism that is not anchored in identity or other immutable factors you can't help from birth, but is anchored in constitutions and institutions. And civic nationalism implies a voluntary participation in civic society. You can migrate to a country and become a participant in that country's nationhood. You can not belong to the majority faith or speak the majority language or any of those things, and you can still be a civic nationalist in a way that you're not permitted to be by the ethno-religious nationalism that is the alternative idea. Now, with this, I turn to the Indian experience. Our nationalism during the nationalist struggle was very much a classic anti-colonial nationalism. It was the Indians throwing out the foreign oppressors, and that obviously includes obvious classic elements of ethnicity, religion, all the differences we had with the Brits whom we wanted to throw out. But what was interesting was at the moment of independence, we were in the process of imagining our nation through a constituent assembly that after 2.5 hours of intense debate wrote the Constitution of India that enshrined a certain concept of Indian nationhood. Now, what was very interesting for me was that our nationalist movement had ended, in a sense, and Gandhiji would have said so, in failure with the partition of the country. What did the nationalist movement divide over? It did not divide over geography. It wasn't North versus South. It did not divide over ideology. It wasn't Marxist versus capitalist. It divided on one simple principle. Should religion be the determinant of our nationhood? And those who said that religion is what determined their identity They left and formed a separate country for Muslims called Pakistan. But the remainder, starting from Mahatma Gandhi and embracing Nehru and Rajendra Prasad and Maulana Azad and Sardar Patel and Dr. Ambedkar, the whole lot of them, they all said, no, our freedom struggle has been for everyone. We will create a country for everyone. And in the Constituent Assembly, there were very interesting debates, even on this very principle. There was a chap who stood up and said, now that Pakistan has been created as a country for Muslims, shouldn't we be a country for Hindus? And this was debated and thrashed out, and the overwhelming view was that ours should be a civic nationalism of equal rights. And this principle, which is enshrined in a number of articles of the Constitution, I'm sure Sai Deepak can give us the numbers, that assure you freedom of religion, freedom of worship, freedom of expression, freedom of even propagation of religion, and ultimately ensures the equality of all citizens, irrespective of their religion, their caste, their language, their region of birth, any of those elements. That is ultimately what India's constitution is all about. And to my mind, that was the idea of India. Not just the sort of mystical idea of India, the civilizational idea of India that I've written about and in my book and Era of Darkness, which is very important. It's part of who we all are and what we emerge from. But that civilizational idea has now been entrenched in a legal constitution that prescribes certain rights, privileges, and duties to all of us. And that's what the Constitution, the civic nationalism that our Constitution has given us. Now, as Nandita was saying, there is an alternative idea to this. And then the 105 amendments don't make any difference because they haven't amended this basic concept, which is central to the Constitution. None of these elements, forget the basic structure doctrine, but none of these elements I've specified that essentially guarantee equality have been amended in those 105 amendments. So the Constitution stands for that sort of India. I know some people like pointing out that the word secular was interpolated only in 1976. But you can take the word secular out and the Constitution still remains a secular constitution because of all these other articles I've summarized. And therefore, the idea that you have no disability because of some immutable characteristic you were born with, that idea is central to my idea of India. Whereas the alternative idea of India is the one encapsulated in the slogan, Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan, which we have heard for some time from the votaries of the Hindutva doctrine. And as I've explained, I've explained the ideology in greater detail in Why I'm a Hindu, but in this book, I've summarized some of their main thoughts, and essentially their arguments on the constitutional aspect were one of rejection. Essentially, Savarkar, who came up with the concept of Hindutva, Golwalkar, who was the longest serving head of the RSS and was its head at the time the Constitution was adopted, and subsequently Deen Dayal Upadhyay, who was the key political leader of the Hindutva movement until his untimely death in the late 60s. These three gentlemen said the same thing, which is that the Constitution in here has a fundamental flaw in it, and that flaw is it seems to assume that the nation of India is a territory called India, and the Constitution has been written for all the people on it. Wrong, they each said in their own words. Wrong. A nation is not a territory, it's a people, and the people of India are the Hindu people, and the Constitution should have been written only for a Hindu Rashtra. Now, this is a fundamentally incompatible idea with the idea enshrined in the Constitution. And this is where, in my book, I talk about where the two ideas diverge. There is some detail that I've gone into. There's also a lot of anecdotes and stories from my own personal life and experience, whether it's about ideas of nationhood coming from, for example, refugees. I talk about an Eritrean refugee I knew in the UN who'd become Swedish, and somewhat amusing, somewhat troubling episode involving him. I talk about a couple of non-ethnic Indians I know, as it were, or non-passport Indians who fought to win Indian passports. One just passed away last week, my Australian professor at St. Stephen's College, David Baker, who recounted with some wry amusement how astonished these officials in Delhi were that in those days, in the 60s, 70s, a white man would be busy demanding the right to surrender all the privileges that came with his passport to become a humble Indian at a time when travel was so much more difficult for Indians and so on and so forth. So I talk about why he wanted to be Indian, and I talk a very different story about a gentleman who was the first Pakistani official of the United Nations in 1948, the president of the Students' Union of Lahore University, very then a bright young man in his early 20s who passed Pakistan's competitive examinations and became a UN official. And as he grew and worked in the UN and saw the various countries and nations at work, he realized that he profoundly, philosophically could not accept the two-nation theory. And he not only renounced his Pakistani nationhood, but insisted on applying for an Indian passport. Of course, Indian officialdom was duly suspicious. He had to wait about 30 years before he was finally accorded. And when he was, his batchmates, as it were all top civil servants in Pakistan. They completely disowned him, and he wasn't even allowed to go back to visit his parents' graves in Lahore and so on. So, but though it's a tragic story in the end, as you will read, it's another example of what is the idea. I mean, he was territorially from the part of Punjab that is in Pakistan. He was ethnically, or his family claimed to be of Mughal descent. But conceptually, philosophically, and in terms of the civic nationalism of India, that's where he felt he belonged. And it's a very interesting sort of story, and there are stories like this throughout. There's also a story of a Pakistani soldier who kills his own brother, or rather who orders the killing of his own brother, who is serving in the Indian army. This is a true story from 1965. So if you read the book, you'll see that I do try and explore the issues that I've summarized for you, not just through the prism of theory, but also through anecdotes, stories, and experiences that illuminate the real human dilemmas that lie behind words like nationalism and patriotism and what they mean to all of us. So I'm sorry for this very lengthy answer to Nandita's question, but that's what the book is about.
Okay. I think now the discussion begins. So, Sai, Deepak, what would you like to say and what would you like to ask Shashi?
Am I audible? Am I audible? Yeah? Yeah, okay.
You're holding it, I think, helps.
Oh, okay. So, first of all, thank you, Dr. Krishna, for giving me an opportunity to share space with Dr. Tharoor, and congratulations on your book, sir. I've had the opportunity to go through it, at least the important portions of it. And as someone who typically doesn't use a pen to mark on a book, I was forced to do it this time because there are certain aspects that I came across. The one thing that I certainly agree with Dr. Krishna on is that for all practical purposes, my book is perhaps an inadvertent rebuttal of yours. And my book was released on August 13th. Last week was actually the Chennai release, so to speak. And the good thing that I've done, and this is not an attempt at self-edification, is that I have steered clear of all the Hindutva ideologues, so to speak, in building my case, which is that there is no reference to Savarkar whatsoever. There is no reference whatsoever to even Tagore or Gandhi or anybody else for that matter. And let me start with perhaps a factual correction. Kindly indulge me. Hindutva was not coined by Savarkar. Hindutva was coined by Chandranath Boshu in 1892 in his essay on Hindutva specifically. Long before Savarkar actually wrote on the subject, someone had already thought of it and had actually fleshed out its embodiment, so to speak, and Chandranath Boshu. Yes. So Hindutva, unfortunately or fortunately, is attributed to the mind of Savarkar when in fact it's not. So that's the first factual correction. Second, I wouldn't dare use the word criticism because I would be stepping into too large shoes. I wouldn't do that. But my own impression of your book is that perhaps it takes a truncated view of what people crudely dub as Hindu nationalism. I have addressed certain parts of that actually as part of my book. The idea is to place the current movement and the awakening of this particular society within the larger canvas of what global scholarship refers to as decoloniality, which is to basically say that post-colonial societies are trying to shed the baggage of post-colonialism and wear the lens of decoloniality to be able to re-access their past and not recreate their past, but to reinscribe certain values of the past in the institutions of the present and hopefully chart a more indigenous future. But it's not possible to completely create an indigenous future simply because it happens to be an integrated world. And that's the reality that you have to deal with and actively engage with. So the idea is to create perhaps a hybrid future which has a greater quotient of indigeneity as opposed to coloniality. Let me say this with as much humility as I can marshal at this point, that perhaps your previous book on the British colonial period, as well as this book, completely missed the scholarship of decoloniality, because unfortunately, Bharat's experience with colonialism is being approached with a blinkered vision, and I'm making a reference to a general school of thought, and I'm not making this personal at all. Because the idea that Hindu nationalism is fundamentally exclusionist and comes to the detriment of and at the peril of religious minorities in this country is to impose the guilt as well as the framework of European nationalism on Bharatiya consciousness. And every mistake and every folly and every massacre or every genocide which was perpetrated in the name of European nationalism is somehow consciously and unconsciously sought to be transposed onto Bharatiya reawakening. I do not wish to call it Hindutva, I do not wish to call it let's say any twa, so to speak. I will simply call it Bharatiya Dharmic Civilizational Reawakening, which is what it translates to. The problem is, unfortunately, whenever this discussion starts, we seem to be fixated with certain personalities, which is Savarkar, so on and so forth. I am happy to completely discard Savarkar, and I'm sure this is going to get me a lot of hate mail, completely discard Savarkar to build a case for Hindu civilizationalism or Dharmic civilizationalism, because it is possible to do so. And the concept of Dharmic civilizationalism is much larger than any single individual. And to box it and lay it at the doors entirely of one particular person simply because he comes from an inconvenient political camp, so to speak, or espouses a certain cause that may not be politically correct, would be to do grave injustice to the society using one particular individual as the strawman of the argument. So therefore, it is my position, and I say this with all humility, that with due respect to Sri Savarkar and his contributions, because I've seen the tone as well as the manner in which you refer to him, I'm absolutely sure that it's not possible for us to glorify all parts of any individual. You would agree with that. Be it Mahatma Gandhi, or at least I refer to him as Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. I choose not to refer to him as Mahatma Gandhi. Pardon me for saying so. Or for that matter, Dr. Ambedkar. I don't think there's a single individual, if you choose to start scrutinizing them, that you would find yourself agreeing with all parts of everything that they say. Be that as it may, you try and make do with those parts which you believe, define them, characterize them. Therefore, for all his flaws and whatever they may be, Savarkar was effectively putting forth a position which was already in public domain, and he was capturing a certain spirit. But be that as it may, I don't wish to be the mouthpiece of Savarkar here. The point is, it is possible, and it must be so, that you look at this particular concept of Dharmic civilizationalism independent of the lens of European nationalism. Unfortunately, the moment this discussion starts, I think people start cherry-picking certain facts, which is that the constitution is fundamentally antithetical to, or is it loggerheads with the Hindutva vision of a Hindu Rashtra, so to speak. So perhaps you may want to look at the draft constitution that was presented by the Hindu Mahasabha, which actually promised equal rights to religious minorities. And the reason why this is important for us to point out is because, assuming for a moment that we did not have the concept of contemporary constitutionalism emanating from Europe, even then, Bharat as a civilization has always welcomed those people who are willing to live with us. We did not have a constitution when persecuted Parsis knocked at the doors of Bharat. We did not have a constitution when, let's say, the Jews from your state, so to speak, and even from the Northeast, knocked at the doors of Bharat. So to attribute certain large-heartedness entirely to the constitution, I would say, is to protect the constitution at the expense of the civilization, which I think is grave injustice, grave injustice.
I've never done that.
I'll just finish my point. So as far as I'm concerned, to assume that the constitution is somehow a civilizing tool which seeks to educate and civilize and, let's say, uplift a certain regressive society, which is at loggerheads with the value of constitutionalism, which doesn't know what is democracy, which doesn't know what it is to accommodate minorities, no. It is a product of the fundamental spirit of this particular land. And despite the horrors of partition, which we must never forget, despite the reality and tragedy of partition, which we must never forget, despite the reality of the two-nation theory, which was specifically foisted on us, which we must never forget, I think this country has done a vastly superior job of protecting its minorities than our former, let's say, estranged cousins, so to speak. And I think the proof of that lies in the fact. So it actually is very, very surprising when we are constantly told that this particular country, if it becomes a Hindu Rashtra or if it becomes a Dharmic civilizational state, so to speak, is bound to become what you refer to in your book as the Hindu Pakistan. I'm sorry, I think that's grave injustice to the people of this country, because accommodation is something, and accommodation, not Western style assimilation. Accommodation has been the spirit of this country, because Western style assimilation requires you to convert to their way of life in one form or the other, either overtly or covertly, in order for you to be accepted as part of the particular society. It is this country that makes it possible for people to keep their culture alive in the most perhaps pristine form possible, so long as it does not come in the way of others. So I would actually make the case that Dharmic civilizationalism is what is crudely dubbed as Hindu nationalism. And as a student of constitutional law, not to claim specific expertise or drop names here, I believe that whenever public morality has been referred to in the Constituent Assembly debates, the reference has been to the reservoir of this country's public morality drawn from the vast ocean of dharma. And as far as I understand, the concept of dharma is native to this particular land, so to speak, and its culture. And there is one clarification or correction that I think is very, very important, that it's possible to simply reduce the so-called Indic reawakening, so to speak, as identity politics. It's possible to muddle it to the level of identity politics. In my humble opinion, that would be perhaps the most superficial way of looking at it, because scholarship, psychology, political science, as well as students of history strike a very clear distinction between identity and consciousness, which is to say you can be a Hindu in name and still think like a foreigner, because your language and your accent and everything could be something that is completely alien to this land. So according to me, identity is less important and consciousness is more important, which is why if I had to choose between an Aurangzeb and Dara Shikoh, I would choose a Dara Shikoh simply because in consciousness, he was closer to the Hindu spirit, notwithstanding his identity. But Aurangzeb, for all practical purposes, his consciousness and identity were one and the same and completely antithetical to the nature of this land and its accommodative spirit. So that is the distinction. And the third point that I think needs to be made very, very clearly, because Savarkar's work, whether it is capable of being misinterpreted, misconstrued, or interpreted in the right manner, is not the touchstone of Indic Renaissance, because it is the typical strawman. One of the strawmans that's created is to basically say Hindutva is ethnocentric, it has a certain obsession with race, and therefore in its rejection of religious minorities, it is merely presenting another form of xenophobia. The fact of the matter is this land has accommodated several races, and not all of these races are necessarily native to what we understand as Bharat. They have come from several parts of the world, but have ultimately become part of this particular land simply because their way of life has managed to find a way of coexisting with us without actually having a fundamental principle which sees us as subhuman or dehuman. So anyone who is willing to let go of any particular tenet that has the effect of rendering me a second-class citizen or a second-class human being, forget citizen, is welcome in this particular country so long as he doesn't threaten to sever my roots to this particular land. So the idea which I'm trying to present is that Dharmic civilizational reawakening is not a restatement or sophisticated way of presenting xenophobia or ethnocentrism, because ethnocentrism and xenophobia are the legacies of European style nationalism, not Bharatiyata, so to speak. We have to be understood in terms of our ontology, epistemology, and theology in that particular order, not in terms of anthropology. Anthropology is the obsession of the European Westerner, not of Bharatiyas. These clarifications are extremely important. I'll wait for his rebuttal and then I'll go to the next point.
Shall I? Well, in all fairness, I think you've said some very interesting things, some very provocative, but some that I don't disagree with. And what worries me is that you choose to criticize me on the basis of setting up a straw man of things I haven't said. I've written rather extensively on something. I think I first wrote about Dharma in the Great Indian Novel 40 years ago. And so it's not as if, 32 years ago. And so it's not as if these are not issues I've thought about. I have no difficulty with the notion of the dharmic civilizational roots of our culture and of our country, but I would rather follow the Vivekananda view of what Hinduism is all about, as I have explained at some length in the book Why I'm a Hindu, rather than the view that has been encapsulated by Savarkar and his followers, including those who are today in power, and who have put Savarkar's portrait in Parliament and hailed him as one of the great icons of Indian nationalism. And the reason is that Vivekananda is very clear. He was extremely proud of his Hinduism. But what was he proud of? He celebrated precisely the inclusiveness of the faith. He said, for example, in Chicago, in that famous series of addresses to the World Parliament of Religions in 1893, he said, "I'm proud to speak to you on behalf of a faith that has taught the world not just tolerance, but acceptance." It's a sentence I read in my teens and that stayed with me all my life, that I kept thinking about. And the more I thought about it, the more profound it struck me as being, because I went to school like most of us studying that tolerance was a good thing, that tolerance was something that you would, a tolerant king is a good king and so on. You learned that in history class. But in fact, tolerance is a basically patronizing idea. It essentially says, I have the truth, you are in error, but I will generously indulge you in your right to be wrong. That's all that tolerance says. Whereas acceptance, if you like, the Vivekananda view, says, I believe I have the truth, you believe you have the truth, I will respect your truth, please respect my truth. And this, his description of what Hindu civilization and religion and dharma has taught him, is very much what it has taught me. And from that premise, then, I go to a very different conclusion from Sai Deepak's comments. I don't believe that a young Muslim boy being beaten up in the name of love jihad because he loves a Hindu girl is dharmic. I don't believe that a Dalit or three Dalits being whipped within an inch of their life with a belt because they were doing their job of skinning the carcass of a dead cow is dharmic. I don't believe that this poor young fellow, 2 days after his wedding in Bihar, being tied to a tree and essentially flogged to death while being demanded to chant Jai Shri Ram, I don't think that's dharmic. So when we talk in terms of inclusive dharmic civilization, then all I can say is that those forces that have been unleashed in our country in the name of this political philosophy, whatever you call it and whenever it originated, they unfortunately do not represent the virtues of our dharmic civilization as I have learned them from Vivekananda and from many others. I mean, he wasn't alone, and there were many, many interesting exponents of the faith in contemporary times who built on the work of great thinkers and sayers and scholars. Vivekananda is in a direct line of descent from Adi Shankara. Others have been inspired by many others in the Bhakti movement and so on. So we can go into a detailed discussion, but that's another book. And if you're interested, please read my book, The Hindu Way. Or if you're interested in the politics of Hinduism versus Hindutva philosophically, then please read Why I'm a Hindu. But having said all of that, let me come back to this book, which is what I was here to talk to you about. This book does not, in fact, as Sai Deepak seemed to allege, imply that the Constitution is all that we are, or that our civilization has reached its apogee in the Constitution. It's a pretty fine Constitution, highly admired by constitutionalists around the world, but obviously it is the end product of an entire historical evolution. And in our case, for millennia, I've forgotten in which book, but I have written that, whereas the Italian nationalist Massimo Tapparelli d'Azeglio in the 19th century, when Italy was created out of a mosaic of principalities and statelets, rather famously said, we have created Italy, now all we need to do is create Italians. And I wrote that we never had an equivalent of such a thought in India's nationalism, because Nehru and all the others around them, if asked, would have said, India as a civilization, as an entity, as a land, as an idea, has always existed. We are merely giving contemporary expression to the longings of Indians. So there's never any need to create Indians. Indians existed. And in fact, in talking about it, I have argued in many of my writings, and it may even be in this book, that this is not particularly a Hindu idea, though I have great reverence for Adharma, because in fact, whereas as scholars like Diana Eck and so on have said that the territorial configuration of India was essentially sanctified by the endless tracks of pilgrimage from one Hindu shrine to another over literally centuries or even thousands of years, and that's perfectly fine. It's also true that the rest of the world saw us as one, and that, as Maulana Azad pointed out, an Indian Muslim going on the Hajj would be greeted by Arabs, whether he was a Tamil Muslim or a Pathan from the northwest, be greeted as a Hindi, because there was this notion of India or Hind as one coherent civilizational space. So my argument is that it is very, very much something that we can converge upon. Where I'm parting from what I've just heard is in my insistence that recognizing these civilizational values in legal constitutional form by ensuring the equality of all is indeed fundamental to civic nationalism and is explicitly disavowed by many of the votaries of the kinds of doctrines that Sai Deepak is saying. Now, I must admit that since, like most others, I have also believed that the term Hindutva came with Savarkar's book, The Essentials of Hindutva in 1922, and I'm very happy to discover it's not the case. I have to admit that nobody today espousing Hindutva doctrine has put up any monuments to Chandranath Boshu, whereas Savarkar is very much hailed and recited and presented as the fount of those ideas. And the worry about, of course, Savarkar writing is that he was writing very much at a time when very similar ideas were flourishing in Europe, particularly Italy, Germany, and Portugal and Spain at that time, were caught up in very similar notions of ethnic nationalism. And it was no accident that Savarkar described Hindus as a race. He did not use the word religion, he used race because he was writing at a period when these ideas of racial purity were sweeping across Europe at the same time. So that, to my mind, discredited much of the origins of his ideas. But now that Sai Deepak tells me there's somebody else who has had a different understanding of Hindutva in the 1890s, I would be very happy to read him. If, on the other hand, if he has echoed a sort of Hindu-ness, a Hindutva, that speaks to the kind of Hinduism that Swami Vivekananda celebrated, then I have no quarrel with him, whereas I do have a strong quarrel with Savarkar as judged by his writings as well as by the content of his later political life. I think I'll leave the key disagreement to that, because I think that's where Sai Deepak has anchored his arguments, but I see he has taken some notes, so I look forward to hearing his counter thrust and to responding to it.
So, in the interest of time, am I audible? Yes. In the interest of time, I will stick to specific points made by Dr. Tharoor. First is that he believes that the Hindutva that he subscribes to, or the Hinduness that he subscribes to, is that of Swami Vivekananda. I'm actually happy you said that, because while Swami Vivekananda was happy to speak of universalism and universal brotherhood from the podium of the Parliament of Religions in Chicago, he was very, very clear that universalism cannot come at the expense of pixelation of history, and certainly specific disagreements, theological disagreements, which resulted in constant practice of exactly this value called toleration, this civilizing, condescending virtue called toleration, which was resulting in the proselytization of Indians en masse. So much so that at least in two of his works, I'm sure you're aware of it, sir, where he specifically refers to his encounter with a Christian missionary on a ship either back to or from India, where a Christian missionary was constantly spewing venom against the religion of Satan, which is Hinduism. Swami Vivekananda, despite his belief in universal brotherhood, was forced to catch the Christian missionary by the scruff of his collar and threaten him with throwing him overboard. If I may say so, that according to me is Hindutva, or Hindu resistance in action, which is to say, I'm more than happy to accommodate all your points of view, provided you first stop spewing venom against me in the name of your scripture. So the very same Swami Vivekananda, I'm so happy that you've actually cited him, also went on to identify in, let's say, book after book after book, in fact in several tomes, the history of invasions from the 8th century, at least until the 16th century. And this is something that he has never pixelated. So the great thing about these stalwarts or civilizational icons is that they were very clear that there is no inconsistency between recognition of the universal character of dharma and what dharmic communities and civilizations have been subjected to in the name of vidharma. Let's not call it adharma, let's call it vidharma. This is something that is starkly missing, and that's exactly what I've pointed in my book, which is to say that there is a filter called coloniality or colonial consciousness, which actively prevents this particular country, and specifically the majority of this country, from accessing specific aspects of its past and putting it in deep slumber in the name of secularism, because just as you have a problem with, let's say, the concept of tolerance, so to speak, European history, and I'm absolutely sure you're aware of this, is specifically clear about the Christian origins and Christian nature of secularism itself. Such being the case, I think when this particular community stands up and says, I've had enough of secularism, and I've had enough of this inclusivity that is specifically telling me forget everything. You keep citing Dalits, you keep citing everybody else, but you don't wish to talk about the treatment of Kashmiri Hindus and the specific causes behind it. You don't wish to talk about what exactly has happened in Bengal immediately after elections from the 2nd of May. You don't wish to talk about, let's say, certain pockets being created in Assam in the name of religion, dare I say. You don't wish to talk about what is, according to me, the longest running insurgency in this country, which is the creation of a crown colony in the northeast, and therefore there is Nagalim for something. Please Google up what they specifically are fighting for. It's Nagalim for, and a religious figure is specifically mentioned. With all these insurgencies going on, surprisingly, it is the Hindu who is the constant subject of scrutiny, whereas everybody else is spared scrutiny and the rod. So therefore the point is, the Hindu has proved herself, not himself, herself, because Sabarimala, herself, to be more than open to reform in every possible way, because way before untouchability was abolished under Article 17 of the Constitution, the temple entry movement was initiated by the Maharaja of Travancore in 1936. That was already done. So several people, inward-looking people, were more than happy, if at all the Dharma Shastras warranted it, they were more than happy to say, we have to move on. So therefore, I'm merely saying that this particular community perhaps doesn't get the credit that it deserves, and it gets, let's say, more scrutiny than it deserves, whereas everybody else is spared scrutiny. That's point number one. Point number two, any concept must be understood, as Dr. Tharoor rightly points out, in historical context. I completely understand, but it should not be divorced from the unique cultural experience and historical experience of any community. So nationalism, when spouted by a European who is fundamentally a colonizer, is not the same as nationalism from Savarkar or anybody else who is the victim of colonization at the end of the day, who has witnessed two successive waves of colonization running for at least 1400 years. So to say that when we speak of nationalism, it's the same as European supremacism, I'm sorry to say, is to compare apples with oranges, where you're divorcing the entire history and focusing exclusively on the statement. Here, when we speak of nationalism, it is merely a call for throwing off the yoke of colonialism of two kinds. Therefore, this should not be compared with Europeans for the simple reason that you're comparing the victim with the oppressor and the aggressor. That, according to me, there couldn't have been a greater insult to a victimized and a colonized community. That's point number two. And I'll just make one more point, which is Constitution. Of course, it's a fine document, it's a great document, it must be worshipped. Yes, I get all of that. But the point is, Dr. Ambedkar, after having crafted this constitution, during the Nehruvian dispensation, rues the fact that he actually created this constitution because he was seeing it distorted under the Nehruvian dispensation, and he says very clearly that I regret the day that I was given this particular task of having to draft this particular document, because now I realize that a terrible piece of document can be used for the betterment of the people in the hands of good people, but a fantastic piece of document and legal document can be completely misused in the hands of scoundrels. I don't, and this I'm not even paraphrasing, I'm using his words exactly. So therefore, the fact of the matter is, the chairman of the drafting committee of the Constitution regretted having to live during his lifetime to see the Constitution and its values being completely thrown to the winds. That's point number three. And the last point that I think is extremely important is the reference to Diana Eck, her book called India, A Sacred Geography. Surprisingly, when she refers to India, A Sacred Geography, she chooses not to refer to it as Bharat. She still focuses on India, which is exactly why I decided to call my book India, That is Bharat, because Article 1 speaks of India, that is Bharat. Unfortunately, Bharat has been effectively relegated to the margins, whereas India is currently surviving at the expense of Bharat. The problem is, if you look at the introduction of Diana Eck's book, because I've had the specific opportunity to deal with it in my book, she recognizes the fact that as far as this country is concerned, it was created as a consequence of a network of pilgrimage centers. And therefore, there's a triple matrix of nature, culture, faith, epistemology, and patriotism coming together to create this entity called Bharat. But there again, she says, but Hindu nationalism, no. So the problem is, it's surprising that she regurgitates the very same scholarship of Radhakumar Mukherjee of 1914. She comes out with the very same scholarship on sacred geography of Jadunath Sarkar, of R.C. Majumdar. But we are more than happy to cite a foreign scholar by the name Diana Eck as opposed to Radhakumar Mukherjee, Jadunath Sarkar, or R.C. Majumdar, which, according to me, is proof of coloniality or colonial consciousness, so to speak, that we still seek the validation of someone sitting in Harvard. So it has to be someone of Indian origin educated abroad, or it has to be preferably a Westerner who's educated abroad, all of them telling us, of course you're great, you have our validation, you have our blessings. So that's exactly why I said, perhaps we should have, let's say, a face-off as far as India, that is Bharat and Battle of Belonging is concerned, simply because Diana Eck represents everything that is wrong with Western academia. She, according to me, represents what's happening on the September 11th, which is dismantling Global Hindutva Conference.
We are not discussing Diana.
I'll leave that.
Let me quickly, but very briefly, just touch on these 3-4 points. First, on this question of the word secularism and its English, its European origins, I fully understand, because secularism came up very much in the context of a certain history of church-state relations, and that's where it came from. But I have said in my writings for 30 years that I'm not particularly fond of the word secularism. If you look up an English language dictionary, secularism implies a distancing from religion. Whereas in India, we have practiced secularism to encourage a profusion of religion. So in practice, I say that pluralism is a more appropriate word. Bahuswarata in Malayalam, and I suppose also in Hindi, that we have this diversity in our country that's part of our reality. So secularism is simply shorthand because everyone has been using it for so long, they're used to it. When I say pluralism, I usually get a blank stare, but that's all I mean. The diversity, a variety of people in India, which I think we should all accept. That's certainly what I believe in. On the question of Vivekananda's robust refusal to accept being insulted, I'm 100% with him on that. After all, what does he say? He says, I am proud to speak to you on behalf of a faith that has taught the world not just tolerance but acceptance, which is also a message to people of other faiths. Don't try and tolerate me, accept me. I will accept you. I will accept that you're Jehovah, you're Ahura Mazda, your prophet, Yahweh, or anybody is, as far as I'm concerned, as valid a way of imagining the divine as mine is. He loved quoting the Shiva Mahimna Stotram, which essentially says that as various rivers, some crooked, some straight, flow down various mountainsides and end up in the same sea, so also all ways of worship will end up at the same divine. That fundamental idea that Vivekananda made, I would argue, the bedrock of his preaching, and I'm proud to say I've probably read every word the man ever spoke in print, that appeared in print, including obscure speeches in Lahore and here and there. He was the great advantage for me was that, of course, Vivekananda did the bulk of his preaching and writing in English, and therefore I didn't feel I was reading his ideas mediated through a translator, and that made it all the more interesting. But in any case, his ideas were very, very clear, and I have no problem with standing totally and resolutely behind my support for him, because he was not an unself-critical Hindu. Unlike these gentlemen of the day today, or not so gentlemen, who are, in my view, giving my Hinduism and Vivekananda's Hinduism a bad name through their conduct. He was somebody who, for example, he once said, it may astonish you today, 120 years later, he said, I've been wandering through the villages of India as a sadhu seeking alms, but how much better it would be if people like me, if other sadhus would go from village to village teaching science and mathematics. It's so much more useful for India than the spiritual quest in which we're embarked. This is Vivekananda. And I think sometimes we don't recognize that there's been this very healthy reformist inquiring quest within those who are amongst the greatest votaries of Hinduism. So an uncritical defense of every kind of bad behavior that is currently being taken out in the name of Hindutva, and particularly the whataboutery that says we have done bad things, but those guys have also done bad things, to my mind is not the idea. As far as I'm concerned, our duty as Indians is to reform ourselves. And if you want to really bring it down to religion, then as a Hindu, I believe that I would have every entitlement to judge my fellow Hindus when they fall short of the dharmic standards that I've been brought up with. But it's not my place to tell a Muslim how to be a good Muslim or a Christian how to be a good Christian. I can tell them under the Constitution how to be a good citizen, and what of their conduct is not acceptable to me as an Indian citizen. But as a Hindu, my business is only with my fellow Hindus, and if that's the prism through which you want to see the debate, I will continue to criticize Hindus when they misbehave. And I think that those are the three main points. But broadly speaking, let me stress, there has to be some common ground between these views, because ultimately the Constitution is what it is. And we even have the principal votary of Hindutva ideology today, the Prime Minister himself, saying the Constitution is his holy book. So there is a level of acceptance. I've actually asked Mr. Mohan Bhagwat whether he stood by his predecessor's rejection of the Constitution. And he said, look, those were the days when the Constitution was being debated by everybody. I'm not bound by what was said in the 1950s. And if that's truly where he stands, I respect him for that. And he says, okay, his movement will work within the parameters of our Constitution. That's already a very useful meeting ground and a very useful basis on which the government and the opposition should be able to proceed. But I think it's important to recognize that the nation we celebrate has to be an inclusive one, has to be one where nobody is judged by the faith they practice, but by the content of their character, by the behavior that they indulge in, and by the values they stand for. And disagreement within those parameters is entirely acceptable in a diverse democracy. As I've said many years ago, the thing about India that I celebrate, and I said this to foreign audiences, is that in a country like ours, with all the diversities we have, you don't really need to agree all the time, so long as you agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. To me, those ground rules are the rules established in the Constitution. That's the civic nationalism that I celebrate. And within those rules, we can happily disagree, provided those fundamental rights are not challenged. That a Muslim is not told that somehow he is less legitimate a participant in the national conversation because his gods are found in a country other than this holy land of India. That, to my mind, is not acceptable. To me, from my reading of my faith, my civilization, and my country's history. I think I'll leave it there, but I invite you all to read the book, engage with it, and see for yourself whether the arguments I've made are even partly persuasive. I recognize that many of you are attracted to another point of view, but I think it's important to bear in mind that these ideas are ideas that have come as a product of a somewhat long period of reflection, reading, and immersion in these ideas. They're not offered without thought, so I hope I can offer them to you for further thought, reading, and reflection. Thank you very much, Nandita, for doing
Thank you. Does anyone have a question? Yes, the gentleman in yellow. Meg.
Do tell us who you are, and so we understand what the background is that you're coming from.
I request you to just question Dr. Tharoor. Please, all of you, anyone who wants questions, don't make a speech instead.
My name is Meg Kalyanasundaram. I'm director of... My name is Meg Kalyanasundaram.
Hi.
And I'm the director of Indica Classical Library.
Indica?
Indica Classical Library.
Wonderful.
We specialize in ancient Indian texts.
Yes.
Right.
Is this
Congratulations.
Similar to the Murthy Classical Library and so on?
A response to it.
I see. So it's different texts, not the same one.
Yes, a different set of texts. And congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
My questions follow from a reflection. I've read the book fully. It follows from a reflection of section 27 in the book, which is got to do with Kashmir. Mm-hmm. I have a printout of the political map of India, 10th edition, which was published in 2020 and which is on the Survey of India. And the Constitution 51 AC reads, and I quote, "It shall be the duty of every citizen of India to uphold and protect the sovereignty, unity, and integrity of India." So my question is, do you endorse the political map of India published in 2020 unequivocally? Do you, pursuant to Article 51 AC, consider it as part of your civic nationalist duty, to use your terminology?
Very, very much. So this is the chapter on Kashmir that Mr. Kalyanasundaram is referring to, Jammu and Kashmir.
Right.
And let's face it, if I respect the Constitution, I have to accept the decisions taken by procedures enshrined in the Constitution. As a Democrat, I am entirely entitled to criticize the way in which certain things were done. I have said so in Parliament, and I stand by my words then, and indeed much of what I've said in Parliament is reflected in this chapter, which is that I thought it was a very unworthy sleight of hand by which the constitutional provisions, the letter of the constitutional provisions was followed, but not their spirit. In other words, whereas to amend Article 370, you needed the consent of the state of Kashmir, which is normally a consent given by the elected Legislative Assembly of Kashmir. You sought that consent when the legislature is suspended and the governor you have appointed gives you consent on behalf of Kashmir. That is arguably within the letter of the law, but definitely no one will agree that it is within the spirit of the law. And so on and so forth. In fact, one of my concerns that many Tamil friends have expressed is that the sleight of hand we saw there could be applied to any state of India. Strictly speaking, all you need to do is declare President's rule, kick out the elected assembly even for, say, 3 months, and then change any sort of provisions relating to that state under the same techniques used to get rid of Article 370. But as for Article 370 itself, I said at the time, and I stand by it, that even those who came up with the provision, including Jawaharlal Nehru, never implied it was a permanent provision. In fact, they specifically listed it as a temporary provision of the Constitution. But the idea was that it would be changed only with the consent of the Kashmiri people as manifested through their elected assembly. And instead we have changed it essentially by unilateral fiat, while I concede holding to the letter of the Constitution. But I've been to Kashmir as recently as a few days ago. I've had a number of conversations with people there. And I think it's time for all of us to move on from that debate now. I mean, I've said what I had to say, and I said it at the time in Parliament, which is my job as an MP. But today, I would be much more inclined to focus on integrating the Kashmiri people, their hearts and minds better into that territorial map you're so proud of. Because honestly, that is what I think is the larger priority. If we want to celebrate our democracy and our unity, that's where we should focus our energies. I had a good conversation with the Lieutenant Governor. I think he's got very clear ideas and is very much hands-on. A lot of things are happening. I hope we'll see elections as well and restoration of elected government. And that the statehood that they're entitled to. I mean, one Kashmiri politician said to me, I want the same statehood as Kerala, not the same statehood as Delhi. And that's fine. There's no Article 370 in Kerala. And as I say, don't focus only on the territorial issue. Let's start giving them every reason to celebrate being part of that territorial map.
Great. So I take it that you endorse the map completely.
Yeah. I mean, it's been passed by the Parliament, signed by the President. It's now part of the Constitution the way it is.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Tharoor.
But again, don't forget that even the Home Minister said the Union Territory status is not meant to be permanent.
Yes,
so that's part of that map, but it's not meant to be permanent, and I will continue advocating restoration of statehood.
Correct. That's okay. Thank you. No, you need the mic because it's being broadcast on YouTube and Zoom, so they won't hear you without the mic.
I'm Srijit Sai.
Keep it very close to you.
I'm Srijit Sai, and
Much
I'm a
better.
student of information technology.
I'm sorry?
A student of information technology.
Okay.
So on the 23rd, last month, you referred to as the Malabar Hindu genocide as a false memory. What about this as a false memory? False memory.
No, I mean, I think what I said was, historians have written reams about all of this. There are multiple views. There are at least 3 different interpretations I can identify about what happened in the so-called Mapla rebellion and so on. There is if you like, the leftist view that it was essentially a class struggle between oppressed peasants and oppressive landlords and the colonial power. It so happened that the oppressed peasants were overwhelmingly Muslim and the oppressive landlords were overwhelmingly Hindu, and that's why the communal coloring. That's one view. There is indeed the view of what you call the Hindu genocide, which sees it very much through the prism of the assaults on Hindus that took place. So that also took place in the later part of the rebellion. The initial rebellion did not have a communal coloring, but I'll concede that aspects of it did gain that. There's also a third view, which points to the complexity of going with either the first or the second view. First of all, the geographical differences. In different parts of Malabar, you had different experiences. There are anecdotes after anecdotes of Muslim sheltering Hindus and Hindu sheltering Muslims and so on. It was not a straightforward, as we've seen frankly in the riots that sadly have benighted our country even in the last 30 years, there have been human beings reaching out across the communal divide, and it was not one of this kind of unquestioning identification with the religious community. And that there was also no doubt about the anti-colonial aspects of many of the stands taken. And therefore, because of the complexity of all this, to reduce these 3, as I said, at least 3, because there are others. I think the Hindu, or one of the papers, I think it was the Hindu, had a rather lengthy article, perhaps in the Kerala edition, that gave all the multiple possibilities. I said that it would be unwise to go for any one of them. Yes, it is a false memory to reduce all of this to just one interpretation. And I think that in many ways, one of the interesting things about history is that you can read multiple accounts of the same events and come to your own conclusions depending on the prism through which you see them. And I will be amongst the first to admit that no one view is necessarily superior to another, but that definitely the duty of the historian is to dig up as much material as available and put it out there, and that after all history writing is subjective. I concede my attack on British colonialism omitted certain good things the British did, or at least that they feel that they were good things that they did, though I don't believe they did them for us. That's another matter. The truth is that in looking at the vast amount of information out there, you select the points and facts that suit a particular narrative, and that's what I think those who take either just the peasants versus landlords view or just the Hindu versus Muslim view are also doing. I think the story is much more complex than either of those narratives.
I respectfully disagree with you, but...
Yeah, sure. But that's the point about history. We can disagree. And you can give me footnoted facts for your interpretation, and I can find the same for you.
On this question, I'd like to weigh in. It's important because I would not be doing justice to my own position on this particular subject if I didn't speak up on the subject. Be it in journalism or history, I think it is currently boxed by the tyranny of what I call forced symmetry and balance, which is to say that you throw up three different views and say all of them are equally valid, and therefore you must leave it to people to choose which of these is most comfortable to their position, as opposed to focusing on the more objective aspects of history which are demonstrable through clear evidence and facts. How do you judge whether an incident has a communal, let's say, flavor to it, or let's say a communal tinge to it or not, is not just on the basis of who was killed and who are the perpetrators, but on the basis of stated goals and intentions. Let us not forget that as far as that movement is concerned, the larger goal was to actually express solidarity with the establishment of the Ottoman Caliphate, so to speak, and to say that the dismantling of that particular caliphate is an attack on Islam, so to speak. Therefore, to say that this was a peasant rebellion, 20 years down the line, we'll have the very same historian saying that because most of the best houses in Kashmir are owned by Kashmiri Hindus, what happened there was again a rebellion of the proletariat, so to speak. That's what we'll be told next. In fact, that theory is already started, that the problem that most of the people had there was because of the affluence of Kashmiri Hindus. Therefore, what happened there was the same thing. You have another line of history basically saying that the person who demolished Somnath 12 times was doing this to effectively free the people from the oppression of the Brahmin there. Even that history has started. So therefore, I'm sorry to say this can't be accepted, because the fact of the matter is there is a clear solidarity with a movement which is Islamic in nature. Second, you see both the Hindu landlords as well as the British colonial masters, so to speak, as co-conspirators who are holding on to lands belonging to a particular religion. Clearly, the communal flavor of that particular entire movement is out in the open. There is really nothing to judge after that. The fact that a few people who were killed also belong to the same religion of the perpetrators doesn't change the fact that the intentions were clearly communal in nature. Most importantly, it is to the credit of a lot of people who must have sheltered Hindus, no doubt. But let us not obfuscate and indulge in obfuscation when we say that the intention behind the, or let's say the trigger behind the movement was manifestly, avowedly, irrefutably and undoubtedly communal in nature. That is something that must be accepted, because otherwise we will start laying the groundwork for, let's say, for apologia for everything that has happened in this country. I mean, if we are absolutely clear about what happened in 2002 in another part of the country, giving it a religious flavor, why is it that we are so hell-bent on whitewashing everything else? I think the only competitor here, the only competitor here is Asian Paints or Nerolac. They're doing a better job of whitewashing facts.
This incident is not even mentioned in this book, so this honestly has nothing to do with the book launch we're doing today. But I should mention that there was a Khilafat movement which the mainstream political parties, including the nationalist movement under Mahatma Gandhi, had endorsed. And it took various forms throughout the country, mostly peaceful, and in some places the movement descended into violence, number one. But the Khilafat movement was not purely a Muslim movement, because non-Muslims were officially identified with supporting it, starting with Mahatma Gandhi and the Indian National Congress of the day. Secondly, if you read, for example, there's a letter published in the Hindu in Madras by the man whom the Hindutva movement today loves to demonize, Varim Kunat Muhammad Haji, who was the man who was then finally caught, arrested and executed by the British, and who is demonized today as this communal slayer, and who in his lifetime wrote to the Hindu and insisted they publish it and threatened the Hindu with violence if they didn't publish it, saying that as far as he was concerned, there was nothing communal about agitation. There were Hindus fighting on his side, and that people of any faith would be welcome to take refuge in his lands, which at that point were not under British control, and that he was essentially there to fight against colonial oppression. Now, when there are contemporary documents speaking to a different interpretation, of somebody's, this chap, this poor fellow, the Indian Council of Historical Research has decided to strike his name from the list of martyrs of British colonialism in which he has appeared for decades, because suddenly he's being demonized as communal. I despair, because, this is the fellow's own words that you're talking about that are being disregarded in favor of somebody else's demonization of his role in this rebellion. But as I say, none of this has anything to do with my book, or indeed with the notion of nationalism. Neither him nor those who extol him today have turned out to be anti-national or have left India for Pakistan or anything like that. So let's stay where we are on the battle of belonging. They all belong.
Okay.
Perhaps Dr. Ambedkar has said a lot on this particular subject. You must read on this.
I think we'll take one question there. I think we've had a lot of...
But do confine yourself, if you don't mind, to the issues in this book.
Please don't go off the subject like this. Mopla rebellion has nothing to do with this book.
Thank you, Dr. Krishna. My name is Vijay. I run the India Pride project where we're bringing back...
I beg your pardon, the India?
I'm the founder of the India Pride project where we bring back stolen murtis back, and I know it's a cause that both I and you are very close with because you've written...
Bringing our objects and artifacts.
I'm the guy who's bringing back all the idols back.
Excellent, yes.
So
now,
question...
I've actually tweeted in support of this cause. I didn't realize it was... the chap who had contacted me about it is based in Singapore.
Anurag Saxena.
Anurag Saxena.
So
Both of them work together.
You work together with Anurag. Very good. So I'm
my
a strong
question-
supporter of what you've tried to do.
Thank you.
A book on the subject.
Okay. Okay, Vijay, let's
My
go.
question to you,
But
sir-
again, no idols in this book, I'm afraid. So.
My question to you is, since 1977 to 2000, which is covered under the CAG report of 2013, India brought back only 19 murtis, and you've been very passionate talking about colonial loot. And then from 2000 to 2012, India brought back 0. And now we're looking at about 53. And you know the extent and the scale of this loot. And since you so passionately believe in this cause, why do you think nothing was done for the last 40 years on this in terms of legislation, in terms of effort? Not just talking about colonial loot, but also contemporary stealing of our murtis. And I place this question to Sai Deepak as well as the politician who's in Tamil Nadu. Today, the regulation under which heritage crimes are being prosecuted in this land is under Section 370 of IPC, which is actually housebreaking theft, which carries a maximum penalty of 6 years. And in my state of Tamil Nadu, I am an Indian passport holder. I moved back to India. There is a special amendment passed in 1993, which is reducing theft from temples to 3 years. That means if somebody robs a house in Tamil Nadu, it's 6 years, robs a temple in 3 years, it's half. I would request both of you as members of parliament and also constitutional experts.
I'm not a member of parliament, at least yet. Okay.
The August audience, please rectify, help us with proper regulation on heritage crimes so that we
in
can
fact,
bring
our
back more.
legislation, I somewhat despair about this because we actually have a domestic law which has been upheld by all governments, including, astonishingly, the present government through its Advocate General in the High Court of Delhi, which says essentially that any objects purloined before 1972 are not our business and they are legitimately taken by whoever was the power of the past. I find that astonishing. And I have publicly called for that
Doctor,
to
I
be...
will correct that because we have successfully brought back the Nalanda Buddha, for example.
So you successfully brought back the
Nalanda Buddha that was stolen in 1962 from a dealer in London. And it's just that because you are part of the UN as well, the UN statuary.
The UNESCO Convention is more sympathetic to us than the Indian law.
Exactly. We need to
But
fight
when,
it.
for example, the famous case came up on the Kohinoor, this was the argument advanced by the present government's Advocate
the
General.
Kohinoor is just a stone to me.
Attorney
The
General.
murtis are priceless. So for me, I would like your support in not just going after writing about loot. We will need your support in Parliament to stop
the
any
way the
dilution
system
of the
works,
act.
only the government can essentially introduce a law that's debated and passed. Private members' bills are the equivalent of writing an op-ed in a newspaper. You will get that idea on the record and you will do it in a form that is of a draft law. But it is almost never discussed or debated. So in a typical session, you may have 250 such private members' bills introduced, of which 1 or 2 may be discussed and none are passed. That's the real problem.
So you are ruling for 3
So what I'm
sessions as
suggesting
well.
is, if you can work with me on an ideal draft law, I'm quite prepared to introduce it as a private member's bill, but more useful would be for me to take that draft and go and see my friends in the government and say, look, why don't you adopt this?
Thank you.
But it's up to the government to introduce a bill on this matter. And I must say that, judging by what Sai Deepak said, I'm sure he has his own influence with people in the government who are able to bring a law to them. But I think you need legislation to make this possible. Give us a draft of the elements you'd like to see in a law. I can enlist lawyers to write it up. But we need something that we can then take to the government and say, why can't you introduce this?
I think that's a very good idea, Vijay. You know, if you can draft a law. Okay, the last question, okay. There are a lot of people waiting for him to sign his book.
I am named Ravi K. Vallat. I am a human being. That's it. I just want one question. A young author is trying to, or rather got a lot of brownie points. The thing is, we are all forgetting that we are human beings. From day one till today, humanity is missing. You know, you kill that man kills you. I'm tired of that. Where are we heading? We just wanted to know where the humanity is lost. I don't want Mahatma Gandhi being named as Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. All that I'm tired of. You understand? All I want to know is where are we heading? Who is going to try to coin the Vasudeva Kudumbaka? That's missing. You know, we are fighting for and against.
Thank you. Thank
I
you
would like
very
to get
much,
a
sir.
detailed answer. And I also belong to Palakkad, Alattur. I would like to meet you personally after this meeting.
Sure, we're signing books.
Thank you.
Before I'm sorry, there are a lot of people waiting to get their books signed. Before we have the vote of thanks, I would just like to say something, and I've written about this more than once. I think what this country needs is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You know, where people sit across the table, I tell you what's my problem with you, you tell me what's your problem with me, and we come to a via media. I think Nelson Mandela thought up this wonderful idea, and many countries have replicated it. I don't know why India cannot.
The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission related to misdeeds within the lifetime of those complaining.
Yeah.
Our problem is with those who are trying to undo the injustices of 500 years ago and 1,000 years ago.
Continuing injustices.
Shashi, I think unless people give voice to it,
Correct.
and bring it out and say, look, Shashi, you know, your ancestors did this to my ancestors, then after that we end up shaking hands. Don't forget that. And I think that is something we should try. Because how long are we going to keep on fighting?
Correct.
It is a fact that communities are fighting each other. And I feel that rather than going on and on fighting on issues which go back 1,000 years, let's sit together, discuss the 1,000 years, finish it, and go to the next 1,000 years ahead
Better
of us.
resolved across
I
the
think
table
we
than
should
on the street.
focus on the future, because I'm worried that just focusing on the past wrongs, real or imagined or both, will merely scratch at wounds that are not being given a chance to heal. The truth is, we know a number of bad things were done, but they were not done by those who are living amongst us today. And therefore, for me, the worry is, by looking at history as a battle axe to hit people of today on the head with, is, to my mind, a deeply unconstructive approach.
I agree with you there. It should not be a battle axe. I just feel that if somebody, you know, like this Mopla thing, somebody from Palghat says, this is what the Moplas did to my ancestors.
Yes.
And today's Moplas say, okay, I feel very bad about it, it shouldn't have happened. That solves the whole thing. You know, I feel sorry for you. It's saying sorry.
I've written about this particular episode as well, about my family on my mother's side being victims of the likely invasion of Tipu Sultan, and apparently a relative on the father's side being accused of having invited Tipu Sultan to come. So both family trees are, but this is history, and I'm quite happy to leave it in the past. And my point is that I think we really should now focus on what
If I may,
today and tomorrow are going
just
to
to
offer
find
us.
middle ground with Dr. Tharoor on this particular issue, unfortunately, I think the twain can meet here, which is building on your argument with respect to the experience of colonization, where you say, in principle, a sorry is owed as opposed to an amount. I'm applying the very same logic to what has happened to other parts of the country through other dramatis personae. And in any case, wouldn't you rather that you resolve these issues sitting across the table than on the streets?
Oh, definitely. I don't want to go on the streets.
Therefore, reparatory justice is a concept that is finding traction across the world. We are not even asking for retribution or reparation. We are simply asking for reconciliation. Reconciliation is perhaps the softest possible way of accepting and acknowledging something that has happened. Retribution is terrible. Reparation requires you to set things right. It calls for restitution. But reconciliation says, accept, move on so that you don't repeat. That, I think, is certainly possible.
Let's hope so. It's a good note, a constructive note on which to end.
With the native communities.
The Native American. In fact,
Yes.
the
Australians
Canadians even apologized to India for the
Correct.
Komagata Maru episode when they turned away the ship. So that was again 100 years ago, but the British can't bring themselves to say sorry. That's another matter.